Hi, everyone. It's Lindsey Baker with Action Hour. And today I have Karen Sussman, who is president of the International Society to Protect Mustangs and Burros. And her organization, Ispmb'S, just filed a lawsuit, not just, but they filed a lawsuit against the U.S. Forest Services to save the Alpine wild horses in the Apache Sitgreaves Forest. Karen, thank you so much for being here. Now, I understand there was a ruling, and I'd like you to jump into that. We'll talk about that in a moment, but I want people to get a little bit of a background of exactly what's happening with these roundups. I think some of our audiences aren't aware. They may know about wild horses being rounded up, but in particular areas, everything is slightly different. There are different political aspects. Please talk about it and bring us up to speed. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Lindsey, for having me on the show. It's just a pleasure to be here again. I just want to make it very succinct that the government is rounding up so many wild horses that by the year 2030, they estimate that there's going to be 1 million horses, and they want to reduce them to 26,000. This is absolutely far-fetched. It's not true, and we must stop them. And one of the ways that we try to stop them is filing a suit against the Forest Service in the Alpine district of northern Arizona. It's a small town of 150 people. But those horses up in Alpine have been there for since before 1882. In fact, one of our witnesses who came forth and volunteered to help us temporarily said that his family settled in 1882 and that the horses were there before his grandfather even came to that area. He believes those horses were from the Coronado March from Mexico into Canada. And their counterparts the Alpines are located on the eastern side of the forest of the Apache Sitgreaves Forest, and their counterparts are on the western part, the Heber herd, and we've been involved in that case since 2005. And 2005, the Forest Service was going to remove those horses and completely eliminate that herd. And there were at that time 300 to 400 horses in Heber, and we have filed a lawsuit in federal court and stopped them. The horses are still there. And the interesting thing about that is that there were 300 to 400 horses back then, and the recent count in 2021 shows there's only 414 horses. And this
so actually the population has gone down, which is exactly the opposite of what the claims from the National Forest Service and their reports dictate or say.
Right.
Correct?
And this exactly, Lindsey. And this herd is so critical to the future of all wild horses in our country. This is the one reason we wanted to save the Alpine horses, which are their relatives 100 miles east of them. We wanted to save them because there's only 200 horses left in that forest, and they have been stable, from what we can tell, for a long period of time. And so this entire forest would make an entirely wonderful area to study. So we have to realize that the Forest Service and the BLM never wanted to manage wild horses in the beginning. And I detailed in a paper that people can see online on our website. It'll be there for sure on Monday, but it details in clear detail that they've never wanted these horses to begin with. And that is the sad state of affairs. So when we
I just want to jump in and tell people that if they want to get more information, because we may lose people come and go, I just want to make sure, please, this is a critical issue. If you can't stay on, please visit this website. This is where you can get information on how you can help. So, Karen, before we go further, many of my viewers do not know a lot about what's going on. They don't know about the Wild Horse and Burro Act, the law that was enacted in 1971, and how apparently this law is not being enforced. Let's go back a little bit for them and explain that and how that is part of your lawsuit. Is that not correct? Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, yes, it is, because in the Alpine area, we're saying that those horses should have been managed as wild free roaming horses. And our witness even declared that the Forest Service never wanted to manage them. So you have to understand that when in 1971, this law to protect wild horses, a native species to our North American continent, this was so critical at that time, and it passed without one dissenting voice in Congress. If you can imagine that in today's world, this was so important, this law. Prior to the law passing, there was a massive reduction of wild horses throughout the United States and throughout the 10 Western states. Ranchers and all the other people that had interest to remove them had them shot, they rounded them up. And up till that time, they were going, prior to that, they were going to kill plants. The thing that people have to realize is that the Forest Service took direction from the Bureau of Land Management. The Bureau of Land Management was the main force in managing these horses, okay? And the Bureau of Land Management back in the 30s actually was a grazing agency, and they were responsible for killing tens of thousands of wild horses. And then in 1971, the law passed, and they're now the ones that are protecting wild horses. So, Lindsey,
Explain what a grazing agency is for our viewers. Tell people,
well,
not all the viewers know, so please.
Okay, so way back when the West was being settled, there was massive grazing by livestock coming in. And you have to realize that livestock are feral animals. They are not part of this continent. They're non-native to the continent. There was massive, massive numbers of animals, millions of animals. There was a big die-off at one point in the late 1800s. And so the Taylor Grazing Act was enforced and put forth to be able to protect grazing and protect the lands. However, it has never really truly been enforced to this day, because back then they said that cattle people think that they have a preference, and preference is nothing more than the privilege to graze. That's all it is. And that in that privilege, you then have what's called a permit. The permit denotes what they can graze. And back in 1964 to 1984, when the wild horses were then protected on public lands, if there was such a thing as active and inactive AUMs, and AUMs is simply the ability of one animal, like a cow and a calf, to graze 1 AUM per month. And so there was only a certain amount of land. There's just a certain amount of land. It was over allocated. It was over allocated from the beginning of the century all the way up to the Taylor Grazing Act. So this was a way to eliminate small people, and only the privileged grazing people had rights to this area, because you had to own a little piece of property, which could be 100 acres, but your grazing land could be thousands of acres. Okay.
And right. So these same people that were this elite group became the people that are running the Bureau of Land Management. Is that correct?
Many of the people sat on the grazing service, which actually, yes. And also we have to realize that some of the most powerful senators in Congress, and we estimate at least 36 of them, are permittees, have their own grazing areas. So we're looking at a very, very powerful lobby. And it has been since day one of 1971, they have been trying to rid the public lands of wild horses. So it is just critically important that people understand what's going on and can really help to, because honestly, Lindsey,
let me just bring in one more point before you go on. Is it true that they have never done a true study, that the agencies refuse to study the horses? Let's get a little bit of information on that if you can.
Sure, because back in whenever the Wild Horse Act passed, Congress really did try very hard to make sure that the government was going to manage these horses effectively and burros effectively. So they had 18 studies that the National Academy of Science wanted to do, and that was from 1980 to 1982. Study number 6 was never done. This was a critical study understanding wild horses as wildlife. And one example that I always like to use, Lindsey, is that if you look at a dog, it looks like a wolf, but they're totally different animals. If you look at a horse, a wild horse, they look like a domestic horse, but they're totally different animals. So wild horses had to be studied because they're highly social. They live in social groups, and the government said finally that they weren't going to do this study because it would take too long. This study was going to be 7 to 10 years, and they didn't think it was going to be financially feasible for them to do it. Yet the money was appropriated for them to study. Had they studied wild horses as wildlife, we would not have the dilemma now. But I wanted just to say one thing about the allocation of the AUMs way back when the horses between 1964 and 1984. If they would have allocated appropriately and used suitability criteria for wild horses, about anywhere from 60 to 90% of the cattle would have been eliminated over wild horses. Okay. Instead, what the government has tried to do in 1984, they had a massive removal of these horses illegally. They removed more than 40,000 wild horses at that time because on paper, if you look at the ranchers, and I want to emphasize this because this is a very important point. Ranchers make money on their permit, not on their private land. Their private land is not very many acres, but the permit is very large. And so they make money on that permit, and the banks make money on their permit. So if we were to end public lands grazing, the banks would not fail, they would have a great, discomfort because all that money from the permittee every year goes into the banks. Now, I want our audience to know that at least we put in $500 million, $500 million in subsidies to graze a cow calf on public lands. The grazing is $1.35 for a cow and calf on public lands. Okay, can anybody out there feed a mouse for $1.35 a month? That's what I want to know. And you're feeding almost 2,000 pounds of cows out there at that amount. So you can see now the competition between the horses and the cattle. And the horses that have been removed illegally. I would bet my life that 90% of the horses removed that are in holding corrals have been removed illegally.
And a lot of these horses, we have to mention, do wind up going to slaughtered. It's illegal here. There's a halt on it here in the U.S., but they do get shipped to Canada and to Mexico, and they go to slaughter, which is horrific, of course.
And getting back to the Alpine horses, Lindsey, already the first group, we know at least 10 of them or 8 of them went to slaughter. And we
now,
also know...
How can you know for sure that they went? We do know that it happens, but how do you know that they went to slaughter specifically?
Well, because we know there was another group that picked up the other horses, and there were big big trucks there, and I guess I can't say that I didn't see them. I didn't see them go over. I didn't see them go over the border, but the fact is that they were, obviously where they're going to go. And that's what's going to happen on the 22nd of September, unless we can save these Alpine horses. And that's going to be very, very important.
Today.
I know.
So that's already starting on the 22nd. It was a free and open to do that. Is that correct?
Well, it says that it was updated on the 22nd, and they're going to go ahead and they're going to continue to remove 200 horses. They're going to do 20 at a time. So the first one went out in August, and the first group We had people there observing for us, and we have videos of it from a distance, because what was interesting at that time is that the Forest Service had 17 law enforcement people there. It was so protected. It was as if they were expecting the worst scenario they could ever imagine. And nobody was allowed to take photographs, and nobody, you could only go in and see the horses if you had a permit to go in and see the horses. So this really kept the main public away from being able to view the horses. But during that time, I can tell you, from knowing how to handle wild horses and going to many adoptions myself, this was one of the worst run. And this, we can't even call it an adoption. It was a sale. It's not even an adoption. It's a sale.
I have to cut in here and just invite the BLM and the parties involved in running up the horses on. We would love to ask some questions and dialogue with them. So I do have to invite them on. We're happy to have them on Unchained TV. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I do have to get that out there. So really, Karen, I guess I'm pretty horrified right now, and I would love to know what we can do. Is there any hope? I think that's what my audience wants to know right now. What can we do?
Well, I think one thing you can do is just be able to support the groups that are really doing the work for wild horses. And I think one thing that we're looking at is, in order for us to proceed with this lawsuit, we've already expended $20,000 to just do a temporary restraining order for this lawsuit.
Wow.
But what we need to do is raise another $20,000 very shortly. And then over and above that, it probably, because of expert witnesses and so forth, it will be at least another $20,000. So we're anticipating that the total lawsuit will be close to $60,000. And Lindsey, I just want to be able to say that one of the ways that the government wins is because, number one, lawsuits are very expensive, and they hold you up for years and years and years. For instance, our lawsuit that is over right now, but we're waiting for them to fulfill the stipulation that they were required by the lawsuit, is to do a territory plan for the Heber horses. These are relatives of the Alpines. And it took the government more than 15 years to do a territory plan. It still isn't out to the public. When it goes out to the public, our other law firm is going to file against them. So we just want them to know that we are not going to let them gather those horses. Two things.
Hold on a second. I just want to point out to people where they can go here. So they can go to your website, and then how to help is the link I clicked on. And then here's the PayPal. And from there, they can make a donation. They can also share out this video and share out the link. Or you can write your own little post on it. So there's lots of ways to be active in this. I'm getting some questions here. I don't want to totally ignore our viewers here. So let's address some of what are they saying, and then you can get back to, I'll give you some time on the end for anything you want to add.
Yeah. And
so right here we have a comment. The Forest Service updated their website on 9/22. The sale date has not yet been posted. And another person says on here, how we can help is quality buyers. I'm trying to find her comment. I'd like to hear what your opinion is. What you can do, quality buyers, sanctuaries, and rescues need to purchase these horses to keep them from going to Mexican slaughterhouses. Are there many of those sanctuaries that are able to help, Karen?
Right now, I think most of the sanctuaries are full, and the problem with that is that although I'm an advocate for it, but my first application is to stop the removal. That's number one. We have to stop them. But if we can't, if we can't raise the funding to do that, then of course I would want to make sure that their lives are saved. But I think with climate change,
if it's unavoidable.
Yeah, if it's unavoidable, the climate change, I think, is going to dictate what's going to happen. For instance, the herd that we manage here in South Dakota, Last year we had no hay, and we had to buy irrigated hay, and we paid $300 a ton. So if you have a lot of horses and climate change continues as it's going, there's going to be less and less grass available. So it's going to be, more difficult for people to afford to, keep up what you have to keep up with to be able to protect your own horses. And the bottom line is this: it is the government's responsibility to protect these horses. It's not our responsibility, it's the government's responsibility. And until they step up for it, and until we make them step up for it, things are never going to happen. In 50 years of the act, we have fewer horses now than we did in 1971. There's just fewer horses out there. And the fact that there is a person who would identify these horses and say that the Forest Service never wanted to manage for these horses, it's amazing. But the cattle industry has such a grip, has a death hold on the last blade of grass on public lands. And today, National Public Lands Day, we should be celebrating. And what I want people to understand, the people want wild horses. The people don't want cattle grazing on public lands. They want wild horses. They want to be able to go out and see wild horses in the forest, and they don't want to see them on birth control. So, and that was another subject I wanted to bring up, Lindsey. And I just want to say that Ispmb is the only wild horse organization out there that is totally against the use of birth control. It's a uterus. It will affect the
Again,
ovaries.
I can't substantiate that information. I have spoken to several different. I'd rather stay away from that issue and stay more on the issue of stopping the roundups, because there are many groups that come on and with differing views on that. In my opinion, my humble opinion, is that we really need to focus on stopping this. For example, on your website, is there a place for people to contact the government, and would that be effective?
I think what they can do is simply write their Congress people and tell them, here's what we would like them to do, is to make the Heber wild horses a study herd. That's something that the government has never done in 1984, is to study them, and because once they do understand that it's the highly evolved social structures of the animals that limit their own population. And every time the government goes in and every 4 years does a roundup, they disturb these social structures to the point where they're destroying their entire communities. And they do that every 4 years. The horses have no chance to revive themselves and survive. And a good example I think I had sent is the fact that when the law started in 1971, they looked at all wild herds throughout, or in 1980 and 82, when PRIA, Public Lands Rangelands Improvement Act, was indicated that they had to know everything that they could about wild horses. One group studied horses all over the world and found that only in, I think, out of 8 wild herds untouched in the world, there was only one filly that was 2 years old and pregnant. One. And this is what happens when you disrupt the wild horse social structures. You start having these young stallions who are teenagers, like our teenage boys, and they're impregnating anything that they can touch. And I'll give you a fine example of our herd that I looked at. We have a very old Spanish Gila herd that was taken out of southern Arizona. And I was observing one day a young filly that was having her first estrus. So that makes her 1 year old when she's having her first estrus, in which she can get pregnant. And she ran up the hill to all these bachelors, and they were just so excited to see her. And then I had 3 family bands involved in this. The family band at the top of the hill was not her natal band where she came from. The first stallion didn't discipline the young studs. He disciplined the filly and made her go back down the hill, and she still didn't go into her natal band. So another stallion came out and disciplined her and pushed her back into her natal band. And she was never pregnant until she was 4 years of age, having
So
her
what you're
first foal.
saying is the horses will self-regulate if we leave them
Well,
alone.
yeah, I don't like to say self-regulate because that such a negative connotation in biology, but they keep their population at a
Got it.
minimum.
Yeah.
And so and until that is understood and accepted, and that's why I want to say that when we promote this birth control, what we're really saying in essence is that there is an overpopulation of wild horses and that they do need to have birth control. And I want people to know that in 1980 and 82, one of the studies that got off the ground right away was birth control, because the government wanted birth control. They wanted a way to control the population. So that
But you're
got off the
saying
ground
that
right away.
there isn't a population explosion and they're still
No.
going in and they're taking and rounding up the horses. So I think the big issue here is to focus in on how do we, when there's so much lobbyist, now $20,000 is a lot to raise. So how do we get this message to people of how important it is for them to give you the funding that you need? Maybe let's talk about that for a moment.
Well, it's critical because our funding is going to be able to, if we can protect this herd, it is to me another one of those ancient herds that have been untouched by humankind. And it just is going to be extremely important that we protect this herd as best we can, and we're going to be able to save 200 horses from going to slaughter. This in conjunction with what I consider the horses on the other side of the forest. These two herds have to be protected. And my goal is to get them both studied. If we can protect the Alpines, I would like to have a study on those horses and a study on the Heber wild horses. They're the only horses left on public lands that have been untouched. And the most important thing to understand about this, because there's a lot of advocates out there, including writers, of wild horse issues, that state the only way you're going to reduce a population for wild horses is to have mountain lion predation. Well, yes, that helps. However, that this herd, the Heber herd, has very little mountain lion predation, and their numbers are still pretty much stable. And what that tells me, it correlates with what the National Academy of Science said, that when you use, the government uses a 20% increase in birth every year, and they double every 4 years. I do believe that they can double in 4 years because of the disruption. However, they stabilize after that if they're left alone. However, that 20% increase is based on no death rate, according to the National Academy of Sciences. So they picked that one based on the fact that they had very poor ways of being able to do the censusing in the very beginning. And so when they censused the horses, they never counted all the horses. There were 60,000 in 1971. And because our census techniques were so poor, there probably could have been 120,000 at that time. And so when they started to gather these horses, all of a sudden, their numbers weren't going down. But according to the National Academy of Science, they're speculating that is probably because of the fact that they didn't have good census techniques. And oftentimes they did it once a year. So they might be in a different place at spring, summer, winter, and fall.
Right.
And so if you census once a year, you don't have that. So it's just going to be critical that we get these herd studies. So if you can write your congressman, I encourage everybody to write your congressman, tell them they must study the Heber herd, and we must save the Alpine wild horses.
And what we can do is put a link, we can provide them with a link to click at the top of this post. And while they share it out, it will be even more effective because the links will be there for people to see it and take action. So we're going to ask people to do that. This is a very disturbing factor. And I know from having spoken to many folks, I know Craig C. Downer is a friend of yours, and I know he's an ecologist and agrees with you about certain theories. But, you know, this is such a critical issue. And he comes on and talks about it doesn't just affect the wild horses, which of course extremely important, the heritage that's part of our heritage, that's part of our country, but it's also very important ecologically to our survival. And as we continue to let these animal agricultural people that are involved in animal agriculture to continue to decimate our forests and wild lands and our wild animals, we are going to suffer as we are right now with climate change. So it's a critical issue on so many levels, and we need to hold our representatives accountable. I want to thank you so much for the work you're doing. I know how much money of your own money you've put into this, and you're just hoping that people will donate and support your efforts, and they can do so by going again to your website. Let me put that up again. Karen, is there any last words you want to get out to our audience? We're just about at the end of our time. Go ahead, I'll give you the floor.
I just feel like Craig is right about what horses do. Horses restore the land. And that I want people to understand that 70 to 80% of their manure actually has undigested seeds and plant material in there. They are reseeding the forest up in the Apache Sitgreaves. The cows absolutely do not reseed the forest. They're devastating to the land, and the government has still continues to cater to them. So we just really need to protect our wild horses for the future of our lands and for the future of all Americans, because we want them to survive.
Absolutely, absolutely. And my guests are asking for you to come back again, which I will invite you back for a follow-up. And hopefully we'll have some good news. But the good news, folks, is only going to come if we all work. And I plan to share this video out and donate and also do whatever I can to help out with the situation, because it is important that we save the wild horses and we hold those that are supposed to be protecting them accountable to the laws that are in place to protect them. It's that simple.
That is the key.
Yeah. Thank you for being on, Karen. We will have you back on again. Thank you, folks, for watching, and we'll see you again next week. Take care, everyone. Be well.
Thank you, Lindsay, for the opportunity.
You're welcome.